everyone. Welcome to Words for Granted, a podcast that looks at how language changes over time. For today's episode, I had a wonderful conversation with author and journalist Laura Spinney about really the entire scope of Indo-European studies. But before we jump into that, a little bit of housekeeping. As I mentioned in the last two episodes, I'm working on a new series tentatively titled History of the World in 50 Words that will be reminiscent of the original etymology-focused episodes of Words for Granted. The idea is that it will be a 50-episode series that roughly tells the history of the world through an etymological lens, one word per episode. I'm hoping to launch that in the fall, but as of now, I'm still gathering feedback. It's a video series, something in between a podcast and a documentary, so if you want me to send you a draft of episode 1, shoot me an email at wordsforgranted@gmail.com, and I would love to hear your thoughts. Also, I want to thank Shafak and Marissa for supporting the show on Patreon. Back in the day, I used to produce bonus episodes for Patreon supporters. That's not really in the cards these days, but what I will be doing is posting ad-free episodes for anyone who signs up that wants to support the show. Trust me, I know the ads are annoying, but we've got to do what we got to do to keep this show sustainable. All right, enough from me up front. On to today's show. All right, Laura Spinney, welcome to Words for Granted.
Thanks, Ray. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we are about to get into one of my favorite topics, which is Proto-Indo-European. I'm sure that many listeners of this show have at least some familiarity with this language, with the people who spoke this language. But for those who may not, and even for those who do, who might need a refresher, my first question to you is, what was Proto-Indo-European?
Okay, so proto means first from Greek, and Indo-European is the name we give to a family of languages that, as its name would suggest, spanned even in the ancient world. Many of the languages of Europe and further east towards the subcontinent. In fact, at one point in time, even further east than that. Today, there are about 400 living Indo-European languages and dialects, but there have been many more. And it's considered the largest family of languages on Earth today, whether you measure that by the number of speakers or by geographical spread. So it's huge. Proto-Indo-European is the presumed last common ancestor of all those living languages and many of the dead ones too. It is thought to have been spoken before writing was invented, and even to have died before writing was invented, certainly died before it was written down. So it is, technically speaking, a hypothetical language. We can't prove directly that it existed, but linguists basically agree that it probably did. You can talk about different forms of it, different dialects, whether what we're reconstructing when they try to reconstruct this language is one real language that was actually spoken or a sort of amalgam of different dialects that were spoken by different groups at different times. But the bottom line is that something called that was probably spoken. And in a way, it's needed to explain the relationships between the descendants that are recognized today.
Right. So we will definitely get into some of those relationships. I want to discuss how it is that linguists are pretty much sure that this language did in fact exist and that it's not just pure wild speculation, that there is indeed some grounding to the hypothesis. But before we jump into that, I was wondering if you had an opinion or any thoughts basically on why this story is so unknown. I mean, it's obviously known among linguists. It may be known among fans of history, and in particular prehistory. But it's always struck me as a very important story, or at the very least a relevant story to a massive amount of people on the planet. I mean, I think it's 3 or 3.5 billion people today who speak an Indo-European language. I mean, I call it the greatest story never told, except now because you've written a book about it. So yeah, why do you think it is that people just don't know about this story?
It's a really interesting observation. I mean, in the introduction to my book, Proto, I think I say that the development of Proto-Indo-European, or the emergence of Proto-Indo-European, because it would certainly have emerged out of other languages that preceded it, was easily the most important event in the old world, by which I mean Eurasia, in the last 5,000 years. And to date, no one has picked me up on that. But I would love them to, because I'd love to have a really good debate about it. But if you think that, language is sort of the oldest tool of humanity, we've done away with the old Sapir-Whorf theory that it shapes the way you think, but it's still, I think it's reasonable to say, linguists would agree for the most part, that the language you speak, or the languages you speak, shape your perception of consciousness to some extent. And certainly there's association between, for example, the stories we tell, the myths we tell, and the languages we speak. So I think that the fact most Europeans, nearly half of humanity, speaks an Indo-European language is very significant. And so, as you say, it is unusual that this story isn't better known, I suppose. It may be because we're dealing in hypotheticals, because it's important to get at the truth of this story in a direct way. You have to circle around it indirectly for the reasons I've already said. It was never written down. Language doesn't fossilize, nor do the parts of the body that produce it. So maybe it's that it's difficult to talk about a story where there's so much uncertainty and you're essentially dealing in scenarios that you rank by probability.
I think that's right. And just sort of in prepping for this, just an hour-long episode, I know you literally wrote a several hundred-page-long book about this and spent several years of your life on it, but just me, myself, and in preparing for how I wanted this conversation to flow, I realized that it's really, really hard when you have a subject that is just so inherently interdisciplinary. It's hard to know where to start. I mean, you have archaeology, you have genetics, you have linguistics, you have history. I mean, even for myself, someone who's pretty familiar with this material, I still find myself, when we get into the geographical aspects of the story, when it comes to, the Proto-Indo-European homeland and the migration of its speakers, both of which we'll get into, I find myself still having to look at maps, having to look at where the rivers are, having to look at where the lakes are, where the mountains are that are, relevant to this story. So, yeah, it's just, it's, I think, inherently a very challenging story to tell.
It is, and it does, as you say, cover a huge swathe of the world, and a world that, while it's very recognizable to us, it's still the same world, essentially. It's the world that emerged from the last ice age. That's where, to situate your listeners, that's where the story starts, about 10,000 years ago. But it's foreign to us in many ways. I think it's a story where ideally you'd be sitting in a map room, with all these maps around you, because, modern borders don't mean anything then. But I think, the source of the sort of difficulty in getting at this story and the puzzlement is also the source of its charm and its intrigue. Because even the way that we have to get at it, I personally love the fact that you can only tell the story by bringing together linguistics, archaeology, and geneticists. And as I say in the book, these are people who, don't necessarily speak the same language themselves. Linguists don't agree among themselves, let alone linguists with archaeologists or linguists with geneticists. So it's the ultimate exercise in many ways in interdisciplinarity. But the question is so important that, everybody's motivated to find out more, even if we can't get at the absolute truth, to fill in the gaps and try to understand what was most likely to have happened.
I think that's enough scene setting for now. I want to move on to the actual discovery, and I'm putting that in air quotes for listeners who can't see me, the discovery of Proto-Indo-European. So how did it happen? When did it happen?
Yeah, because we have no record of it. So you'd have to say that it was a gradual process of understanding the contours of this Indo-European family, I suppose. Today we say that the Indo-European family has, it depends how you measure, but people generally say 12 branches, of which 2 are extinct. The Anatolian branch, of which Hittite is probably the most famous ancient exemplar, and the Tocharian branch, which was the most eastern branch, although it's now died out. And then you have the Celtic branch, the Germanic branch, the Italic branch, just to run through them initially at the beginning, the Baltic branch, Slavic branch, Indic, Iranic, what am I missing out? Armenian, Greek, and Albanian. You could probably go further back because the ancient Greeks probably gave this some thought. But I kind of start the trail with Dante Alighieri at the turn of the 14th century in the Middle Ages, who looks around him at the linguistic landscape of Europe at that time. And by that time, Latin, though it was still spoken, was essentially shuttered into academic institutions. It was no longer the vernacular. It had already split into its offspring, Romance languages. He looked around and he sort of realized that the Languedoc, what is now Occitan, and the Languedoc, which became modern French, and the sea languages, as he called them, of Iberia and the Italian peninsula were probably descended from a common ancestor. So he had basically recognized what we now see today as the Italic branch of this Indo-European family. And others identified a Germanic branch, and there was this kind of piecemeal identification of the different branches. And generally speaking, people recognize the moment when Indo-European family comes into form in public consciousness as the year 1786, when Sir William Jones, nicknamed Oriental, who was a judge and imperial administrator in Calcutta at the time, gave a speech at the Asiatic Society, at which he famously said that these branches, Sanskrit, Greek and Latin, all descended from a common ancestor which maybe no longer existed. And he proposed additionally that Celtic, I think Persian and German may have descended from the same ancestor. This insight has been repeated in countless linguistic books. And I think it's reasonable to say that Jones, in a way, defines the Indo-European language family for the first time as we recognize it today. Implicit in what he's saying there is the concept of evolution, that these languages have evolved from a single language that existed in the past and fragmented as they went. So obviously people's minds turn to what was that common ancestor? When did it exist? Who spoke it? And where did they speak it? And it's called Proto-Indo-European simply because that's what you might call the first language of a family, because we don't know what its speakers called it since they didn't write it down and we have no way of knowing.
Okay, so we have this British administrator, William Jones, who's working in India. He's looking at some Sanskrit texts. He identifies the similarities between some of the Sanskrit lexicon with the Latin and Greek lexicons. I don't know if we can say definitively when, but something that starts to look like the study or discipline of modern historical linguistics begins to emerge at this point in the story. You could argue, of course, that the older discipline of philology is something of a predecessor to this, but historical linguistics, strictly speaking, or I should say historical linguistics in the sense of trying to reconstruct older, unattested languages, pretty much comes into the intellectual consciousness at this time. So I just use this term, reconstructing languages. My question for you is, what is a reconstructed language? Why would we reconstruct a language? How do we reconstruct a language?
So, if you think about the way that the family was recognized in the first place, it was because of the similarities between languages. And you're absolutely right that the study of those similarities became more systematic, became more scientific after William Jones's speech. And it was this sort of slow, painstaking comparison of cognates, that is, words that are identified as having been inherited by descendant languages from the common ancestor, across as many of those descendant languages as you are able, and going as far back as you are able, to try and trace this evolution both of the sounds, of grammar in the case of large constructions, and in meaning, the lexical aspect of language, and to try and reconstruct what would have been the root of those cognates in the ancestral language. And, we're talking about inheritance here in a linguistic sense. Languages evolve, I think it's important to say at the beginning, differently from biological organisms, because we essentially inherit our genes from our parents, and that's it. But languages can also borrow from each other. So a major part of the linguist's job, or the historical linguist's job in this kind of reconstruction exercise, is to distinguish loans from inheritances.
And to just jump in and clarify for the audience, by loans, you mean words that were borrowed.
between languages. Yeah, either from related languages or from languages from other families. If languages come into contact, they learn to each other all the time. It's in fact a trace of contact, which is a useful historical tool in its own right. So that's the linguist's task. And they do that by comparing living languages. They do it by comparing historical texts of languages that were written down, but are no longer speaking. So, for example, ancient Greek, Sanskrit, Latin. And all of these things, anything they can get their hands on, basically, that speaks to earlier forms of the languages they're interested in. And they have done that for Proto-Indo-European. They have reconstructed a vocabulary of about 1,600 words, or to be precise, roots of words. So, you take the root and you massage it and put grammatical endings on it and you get a swarm of other words. That would have been, a mere skeleton of the language as it was once spoken, but it's not bad for a language that's long been dead, was never written down, dead for 4,000 years. So you can already start to get a sense from that lexicon, from that vocabulary, reconstructed vocabulary, of what language would have sounded like, who might have spoken it, what they might have known, and where they might have lived. There are clues. It's very difficult to get at them. It's a contentious exercise. But I think it's fair to say that the language you speak reflects your reality. That's why we use it, to talk about where we are and what we're doing and what we're thinking. And so the question is, can you take out reliable clues from the reconstructed language about who might have spoken it and where? And that's just one thread of information into this exercise of trying to understand the origins of Proto-Indo-European, who spoke it when and where.
There's one thing that I want to hang on that you said, which is basically that the vocabulary, which we can reconstruct, can indicate something about the life of the people who spoke it. So what do I mean by that? For example, in Proto-Indo-European, we can reconstruct words for wheel and, I believe, axle and wagon. I think there's another transportation or wheel-related term that I'm forgetting, but we definitely have at least these three. The fact that we can reconstruct these words matters not only as an indicator of the technology that these people had, but it also potentially tells us where and when they lived. Because, wheels didn't just fall out of the sky. They are a human invention from a certain time, from a certain place. They didn't exist before a certain period. So if it is indeed true that the Proto-Indo-European language had a word for wheel, what follows is that Indo-European or Proto-Indo-European must either be contemporaneous with the invention of the wheel or younger than the invention of the wheel.
Yes. And you possibly hit on the most contentious example there, but it's really good to illustrate, the nature of the exercise. So there has been a long-running debate over that wheel word because, as you say, wagons, wheels were invented at a particular moment in time. We don't know exactly where, but probably somewhere around the Black Sea, in the middle of Eurasia. The timing is a bit clearer, probably around 3,500 BC, so around 5,500 years ago. And so people who talk about wheels, wagons, that kind of transport cannot, in theory, have lived before then. Right? So that's the sort of information that we could extract. But the reason that word is itself contentious is because some people have argued that the wheel word might have only come to apply to that technology later on. It might initially have meant something else. After all, humans have always known things that turn. The sun, the moon, the menstrual cycle are just three examples, right? So in the same way that mouse originally meant a furry rodent and only later came to have a second meaning of the thing you use to move the cursor around your computer screen, their argument is, this word could have just meant something more abstract to the speakers of Proto-Indo-European and only later acquired the second meaning of a wheel, as in the transportation sense. But I think that argument is sort of lost by now because there are these other words that have been reconstructed in the Proto-Indo-European lexicon. And you mentioned them, axle, to be transported in a wagon. There's a second word for a wheel, which is something like rote, which is the root of rotate. And so taking all this together, I think it's fair to say that most Indo-Europeanists are fairly convinced, confident, that the people who spoke Proto-Indo-European did know the wagon and the wheel. But you can see, I think, already from that example, what a difficult exercise it is and how sort of prone it is to error. And so everybody takes it in that spirit and with a pinch of salt. And in the past, when people haven't been so skeptical about, the outcomes of these kinds of mental exercises, it definitely has led them astray. So, for example, there have been attempts to say where the Proto-Indo-European speakers lived because they used a certain name for a tree and the species of that tree is only found in certain latitudes or so on. And they didn't take into account a very well-established and understood feature of language, which is that meaning evolves. That word may not have referred to that species at that time. The concept of a species of a tree may not have existed at that time. So it is difficult.
A great example of this in English itself is the word meat, which used to refer to not just animal flesh, but to all food.
Exactly. And still can, right? We talk about meat and drink as in collectively our food.
I mean, if you read something as recent as the King James Bible, I mean, I guess that's recent on a relative basis, but yeah, if you read the King James, there are several usages of the word meat in there, which seem very strange to modern English sensibilities, where it's very clear they're not talking about chicken or beef, but just food in general. I actually think there's a quote, which is escaping me right now, that talks about the meat of Jesus, which again sounds very strange, but it's talking more about the spiritual nourishment of Jesus. You get my point.
The upshot is that I think it's fair to say that today people do indulge in this kind of archaeology, linguistic archaeology I'm talking about here, not the real variety. We'll come to that, I'm sure. But they do it in a very cautious, conservative way. And still, there are things from that reconstructed lexicon of Proto-Indo-European that people are confident you can say. For example, there's quite a lot of words in that reconstructed lexicon that are connected with dairying. And there's also quite a lot of words linked with the animals that we presume would have been important to the speakers of that language. So dogs, horses, there's a word for foal. There may even be a word for tame, but that's contentious because we're talking about domestication here. And so that would be another very useful aging tool, but in terms of aging the language, but it's contentious. And so you could sort of start to ask, well, people who kept this combination of animals and who were indulging in dairying, which was, a fairly late development after the Neolithic Revolution, well, where could they have lived? And so these are the kinds of tools we're talking about, and what metals would they have known? That kind of thing. These are all useful dating tools when it comes to the reconstructed language. In terms of the reconstruction in the world of the speakers, I'll give you one more example because I think it's very evocative. In the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European lexicon, there are words that refer to a woman's in-laws, but not to a man's. So that's a kind of asymmetry that is curious and that linguists tend to consider quite informative. And what they think it means is that it was a society where women moved into their mates' families' households, and therefore needed words for their husbands' relatives. And the opposite didn't happen. And they have other ways of thinking that this was quite a patriarchal society, that wealth probably passed down the male line, and so on. So you can also say things about social relationships, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, and mythology as well. We don't have to dwell too much on this, but I did want to bring this up at some point in our conversation. Simply this fact that the Roman, Greek, and Indian mythologies all have gods who are named Jupiter, Zeus Pater, later more famously shortened to Zeus, and Dios Pitar, that is in Vedic mythology of the Aryan Indians. So let me say those again. Jupiter, Zeus Pater, Dios Pitar. So as you might be able to hear, these are all very similar sounding words, and the words are indeed cognate, but not just the words, which is sort of the part that's mind-blowing here. It's not just the words that are cognate, it's the gods themselves. The gods that are actually designated by these words are cognate across these cultures.
And as the descendant languages diverge and fragment and they evolve, but you can tell that they're related because there are similarities, some similarities that they retain, some elements of the ancestral language they retain. So with the mythologies, right? So those gods have different, in all those three languages, the Sanskrit, the Greek, and the Latin, they all mean essentially sky father, or as we would say in English, father sky. But the stories that come attached to them are different in the three branches, and yet they share certain telling elements. So, the story that often gets told is the Indo-European dragon slayer story. I mean, many traditions, many linguistic and cultural traditions tell stories about dragons and dragon slayers, but there are particular features of the Indo-European ones that are very distinctive. So, for example, the hero often has a weak point, which is the source of his downfall eventually. Think of Achilles' heel or Escandia, who receives an arrow in the eye, meaning that their demise comes quite quickly after that of the dragon that they have slain. And so there are, these traits or tropes in the stories that help you to determine that they come from the same background.
Yeah, excellent. So I think we've talked enough about reconstruction and mythology. So what I want to move on to is the modern genetics piece. Because, a lot of what we've been talking about from the historical linguistics point of view has been going on for centuries, as I alluded to earlier. Basically, after William Jones, again, that's that British administrator in India who first proposed the Indo-European language family. After he does his famous speech for the Asiatic Society, the field of historical linguistics is basically off to the races. What the people working in the 19th and much of the 20th century did not have, that we have now, is access to modern genetics, knowledge of DNA. So this is a very broad question, but how has our ability to analyze ancient human DNA changed this field of Indo-European studies?
To go back one step, they did already in the 19th century, of course, have archaeology. And linguists and archaeologists have been collaborating on this question for a very long time on the basic simple principle that, if the speakers of this language really existed, which we assume they do, and a language, as I've already said, is a tool, we use it to express the ideas and beliefs and information that's important to us. And ideas and belief, culture, are all things that leave a trace archaeologically, that is, in material artifacts that archaeologists dig out of the ground. So the archaeologists were an invaluable source of information for corroborating ideas of a common ancestor, always aware of needing to keep the people and the languages separately because they don't necessarily always travel together. But the people who spoke the descendants of those languages moved out from the original homeland, if you want to call it that, and carried the languages with them. You can follow that movement to some extent through the material artifacts that those people left behind. So just to say that linguists and archaeologists have long been working together before the genetics came into the picture. But if you want to know why I wrote my book now, when I did, it's because of the genetics. It's because the revolution that means that we can now take DNA from ancient human remains and analyze it and extract useful information from it has transformed this story in really just the last 10 or 15 years, which is why I felt the story needed to be told again today in the light of that.
Can you say a little bit more about where the modern genetics have either confirmed or denied Indo-European theories that have existed before these techniques were around?
Okay, the basic problem here, as we've said, is that you can't trace the language directly, but perhaps you can trace the speakers. You can certainly trace their ideas through archaeology. It would also be good if you could trace people themselves, and that's what DNA allows you to do. And very interestingly, as a sort of general statement, there has tended to be quite a good correlation between the paths of prehistoric migration that ancient DNA experts have been able to plot by comparing the DNA of people in prehistoric cemeteries and the branching of languages as pieced together by historical linguists. It's not perfect by any means, and you can understand why, because when people move, they come into contact with new people who speak different languages, and so maybe they switch languages or maybe their language changes. Languages can change by mechanisms that don't apply to genes, so it's quite natural to expect and to assume that these things transform themselves differently over time. However, there is a strong correlation, And migration is, even today, considered a major, if not the main, motor of language change. That's why it was a revolution, ancient DNA, because it meant that we could now trace people far and wide. And again, to sort of slightly cut to the chase, what you see about 5,000 years ago is a sort of radiation of people out of the steppes of Eastern Europe, north of the Black Sea, east towards the subcontinent, west towards Europe, and, we presume, carrying their languages with them. And it's important enough, this movement, to drive a massive turnover in the gene pool in Europe. We can detect that, up to 90% in some parts of Europe. So it's really very significant. And it's a very good candidate for the movement that led to the imposition of the Indo-European languages on Europe. And the other piece of the picture that we haven't yet got to is that right up until the 21st century, there were two main theories of where the Indo-European languages came from that were sort of, going head to head. One was that they were born in Eastern Europe, around about where, unfortunately, tragically, the war is being fought now at the borders of modern Ukraine and Russia, and one placing them several thousand years earlier, so let's say around 8,000 years ago, in what is now Turkey, in the Anatolian Peninsula. The Anatolian theory was basically the brainchild of archaeologists who had seen in their archaeology this massive movement of people out of that peninsula after the invention of farming. But it didn't sit very well with the linguists, who felt that the dates of that revolution, the dates of that movement, were too early for their best guess of the birth of Proto-Indo-European, knowing, as they did, even very roughly, the rates that by which languages change and evolve and fragment into new ones. So they were more enthusiastic about the steppe theory, mostly associated with Mario Gimbutas, who argued that they came into Europe around 5,000 years ago with these nomads from the steppe. When the genetics came along and showed this massive movement out of the steppe 5,000 years ago, the linguists were very excited about it because it sort of supported their hunch that this was the right explanation. It not only fit the linguistic data, it also fit much of the archaeological data and now the genetic data to say that the Indo-European languages came out of a place to the north of the Black Sea, the northeast of the Black Sea.
Yeah, this is great. This naturally hits upon something I wanted to discuss, which is the nature of ancient migrations. Even for those of us who are familiar with this Indo-European story, I think it's easy to fall into this trap of a kind of cartoonish understanding of how migration works, particularly these ancient migrations. And what I mean by this is an image like this. So we have this core group of Proto-Indo-European speakers. They're hanging out around the Black Sea. Some of them decide, for whatever reason, to branch off this way. Some of them branch off that way. They travel in a perfectly straight line to some unknown destination. They arrive from point A at point B, completely unchanged. Their genetics are the same. Their language is exactly the same. And then, boom, they impose themselves on native populations, rinse, wash, and repeat until everyone from that little core group of speakers, again, north of the Black Sea, is just gone. They've all left. We don't have that population anymore. And then that's the end of the story. Of course, this is not how the migrations of the speakers of Proto-Indo-European happened. So what I want you to do is paint a little bit more realistic of a picture of how these series of migrations took place over the course of millennia.
I mean, the first thing to say is that I think what many people fail to take into account is that there are many different kinds of migration. First of all, the reasons to migrate change. You're migrating from a war. By the way, many of these reasons still apply today. You might be fleeing a pandemic. You might be going for economic reasons, in which case one person might go and then a brother might follow if the first brother has succeeded, and then wives and children follow. And, that's another kind of migration. Or you might be fleeing climate change, and you might literally be looking back and seeing your natal lands vanish beneath the sea, and no hope of ever returning, certainly in your lifetime. There are many different reasons, and therefore the mechanisms tend to be different. With these people, these nomads, these nomadic herders of Eastern Europe who are now widely considered to have been the speakers of Proto-Indo-European about 5,000 years ago. They did do something extraordinary. We know nothing is, de novo, nothing's out of the blue. They were building on innovations of their own ancestors, but they were the first, we think, to have been extremely well adapted to the environment of the steppe, which is very hostile, very hot in summer, very cold in winter, often difficult to find water, no shelter, and so on. And they managed to survive there, and they managed to do so all year round. And they did it with a sort of package of innovations that made life sustainable, but by moving all the time. And they basically cycled from pasture to pasture with their wagons, with their animals. If you want to put it in biological terms, this package, this lifestyle that they came up with enabled them to extract an enormous amount of energy from those infinite grasslands of the steppes of Eurasia and to turn it into more human beings. And not only more human beings, but taller, healthier, longer living human beings. So they were successful in the biological sense of producing more of themselves. And as they produced more of themselves, they needed to move out because they needed more territory. And as they moved out, they took their animals with them and they took their languages with them. And so the languages edged out. Now, within this story, over the millennia, there would have been smaller migrations for particular reasons, or, all the reasons that people migrate would have been present at some point in this story. And sometimes it was, covetous, it was raiding, it was wanting to push out the frontiers, it was, wanting new lands, new women. And in fact, you can't ignore the social factors here, because it looks as if, again, from reconstructions, that the Indo-Europeans told a set of stories and a set of myths about their own origins and about themselves that justified raiding and justified pushing out frontiers. So it's what you did as a young man, essentially, to prove your worth and to, acquire status in your community. So social reasons are also important. But anyway, that's what we're talking about here in terms of migration. And what the genetics is saying, I'll stop now because I could keep talking about this subject for ages. But I just want to say that it's only in the last 15 years, really, that this ancient DNA has really confirmed how extraordinarily important migration has been in the history of humanity at a time when really their means of transport were extremely primitive.
Truly, truly incredible. I forget, I believe it was about the Tocharians where in the book you mentioned, and this was new to me, I didn't know this, that some new research suggests that the Indo-European group that would become the Tocharians went potentially within one generation from the region of the Black Sea to Western China. Now, that is not close. Pull up a map for anyone who wants to actually take a look at how remarkable this is.
This is my favorite story. This is the Tocharian chapter. Tocharian was essentially the branch of the Indo-European language family that speakers of earlier forms of Indo-European carried out of that homeland north of the Black Sea, and they crossed the steppes of Central Asia, and they carried it as far as the Altai Mountains. And there, the story continues. Of course, they mix with other people en route. The languages change as a result. But the original migration of those people, it is possible, can't confirm, it could have taken a couple of 100 years, it could have taken a generation. It's difficult to be more precise than that with the tools that are disposable at the moment. But, it's not impossible that people will narrow it down more. In any case, it is an extraordinary, extraordinary migration, the likes of which have probably never been seen in the known history of humanity. So one is drawn to ask, why? Why did they set out on that enormous journey, definitely risking their lives? Because, we always think of, and I think it's natural to picture sort of strong, healthy men undertaking these huge journeys. But no, they would have taken wives, pregnant women, sick people, old people, babies, handicapped people. It's the whole community that moves. And as I say, it's not a friendly place to survive. Even today, it's difficult with, GPS and the home comforts that we have invented for ourselves. But then it would have been much more complicated. So, of course, people have speculated about what would have motivated it. One of the theories is climate change. But that can't be the whole story because basically you wouldn't have had to go so far. Whatever the climate disaster was they were escaping, and of course we're talking about a pre-anthropogenic climate change period, so it probably would have been fairly local and they wouldn't have had to go too far to find the grass and the water they needed to feed their animals. So and it could have been multifactorial, but one of the suggestions, which I think is the most mind-blowing really, is that perhaps there was some kind of schism in their set of beliefs that they shared with the other speakers of Proto-Indo-European. Perhaps they wanted to start a new religion. Perhaps they wanted to return to an older, in their eyes, purer form. And perhaps they'd heard that in the East, because these were very mobile people, so word was traveling far and wide, there were these mountains where, were rich in metal. And the people who spoke Proto-Indo-European are thought to have been quite skilled metallurgists. And perhaps they went to start a new life in a place that they considered some kind of Eden.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about. Just a few more questions before we wrap here, because we're almost coming up on time. When I first got into Indo-European studies, I feel like the stereotype for these speakers' success and the success of the Indo-European languages was a violent story. And I think one of the things that you really highlight in the book is that though there certainly was violence in some cases, the violence is not necessarily universal. And just to add further clarity to what I mean by a violent story, I mean basically that these Indo-European migrants were colonizers, invaders, marauders, basically imposing themselves violently upon indigenous populations.
It's a really important point, Ray, because when, I mentioned earlier this massive turnover in the European gene pool that was detected by two groups working independently in 2015, it was a major finding, right? And of course, everybody rushes to explain what could have caused that turnover in the gene pool. And the first cause that people's minds jumped to, not unnaturally, was violence. Like, you can only get such a turnover, the thinking was, through rape, pillage, even genocide,
To clarify one thing, this genetic discovery that you're talking about confirmed that there was indeed a lot of steppe ancestry, steppe genetics in modern Europeans.
Absolutely. So it's not just European, at that time, farmers' DNA, vanishing. It's being replaced by these nomads genes from the steppe. And very often it's striking that the Y chromosome from the steppe is the one replacing the indigenous Y chromosomes. And I think what's happened over the last 10 years is a massive shift in thinking about that. Now, nobody's ruling out violence, and it probably did happen in places. But I think the thinking is that there must have been much more at work. For a start, vague estimates, because it's difficult to be precise about these things, suggest that the population of Europe at that time was around 7 million. Okay, so we're talking about tens of thousands of nomads coming in from the East. Could they really have committed that kind of violence against such a large, stable, indigenous population with such dramatic effect? That's going to take a lot of explaining. One of the new sort of themes of argument that's come in, and there's accumulating evidence for this, was that epidemics did a lot of the work for those newcomers. In other words, that they cleared a lot of the existing populations from the land so that the newcomers simply had to walk in and take over those vacated pastures, and so obviously their language came to dominate. There clearly were dangerous infectious diseases raging at that time in Europe. The geneticists have found the DNA of the microbes. It's difficult to know what the nature of those diseases was, and it's difficult to know because diseases also evolve. So they found, for example, the plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, but did it cause the same lethal disease then as it caused in the Middle Ages? We don't know. We also can't yet be precise about the direction of travel of those diseases, how long they were around, where they came from. Did the nomads bring them with them, or did they simply, pick them up en route from farming communities that they were moving through? It's not yet possible to point the finger of blame at anyone, if it's ever useful to point the finger of blame when it comes to contagion anyway. But the point is, and also, questions arise, like why would the farmers have been more susceptible to these diseases than the nomads? Well, perhaps that has something to do with lifestyle. The nomads live very closely with their herds. Perhaps they had, through generations, and epidemics had more time for their immune systems to become more robust against them. Or perhaps it had to do with lifestyle, the farmers living in more dense communities and so on. All of these questions still have to be answered because this is very new research. But just to say that epidemics, contagious disease is definitely one part of that bigger picture. And then there are also, again, social factors. So the nomads, because they were used to being separated over vast swathes of space and long periods of time, just because of the nature of their lifestyle, they had a set of conventions that helped them maintain social cohesion and identity. And that had a lot to do with hospitality, with feasting, with storytelling, with bards. And perhaps those customs were attractive to the people in Europe who we have reasons to believe might have seen themselves as in the dark days of the end of a civilization. There was a lot of violence in Europe at that time before the nomads arrived, and might have been attracted by these new people with their new ways, and perhaps language spread through those social networks into which they were drawn. So it's become a much more complex, layered, nuanced argument, and to my mind, much more interesting. But it's very much a work in progress of understanding how the Indo-European languages managed to impose themselves on a Europe that was already populated to a very great extent. I mean, I give the analogy in my book, New York at the beginning of the 20th century had a population of about 7 million people. At that time, as you probably know, you have an Italian surname. There was a very large influx of Italian immigrants at that time. Did the language of New York flip from English to Italian? Of course not. The Italians integrated and learned English like everyone else, although they probably kept speaking Italian at home.
Yeah, it's really mind-blowing. And I was going to use that very example if you yourself didn't bring it up. As an Italian-American of that precise migration on both my mother and father's side, very, very salient example for me. I love this idea of 20th century, late 19th century New York, not only speaking Italian entirely, but also becoming culturally Italian. Just again, before we move on from this, to really drive this point home for listeners, the asymmetry between the size of the existing population of Europe at the time and that of the incoming nomads from the steppe who spoke Indo-European and had Indo-European culture, just the fact that these Indo-Europeans ultimately won out over the existing languages and cultures, for me, it's so upon more exposure to the topic and greater reflection, it's just so huge that it must have required some special set of circumstances. I mean, just in terms of these sort of historical asymmetric probabilities that at the time would not have seemed so obvious, I kind of equate this to the success of Christianity in a way. I mean, think about this. It's just unlikely success stories where you basically have a radical Jewish leader from the Middle East whose teachings then basically take over Europe several centuries later after his life. Like wow. I mean, to me, of course, there are many circumstances and reasons why Christianity was ultimately successful in Europe. But I mean, the fact that happened, I would put that story up there with the success of Indo-European languages over all of Eurasia. It's really mind-blowing.
And just maybe this is a good note to finish on, but I wonder how much of it had to do with charisma. I mean, Christianity did, charismatic leaders. And we can't, charisma is one thing that we can see neither in the reconstructed language, nor in the archaeology, and nor in the genetics. So we are left wondering, and there's nothing wrong with that, I think, to have a little bit of wonder.
Yeah, I love that. We definitely can wrap on that. I've had this thought too, that maybe there were just these really charismatic leaders, these tall, sexy, handsome men or women. I mean, who knows? This again is all in the realm of imagination. But in order to really flesh out this story, we do need to rely on our imaginations, and I do think that that's one of the reasons I love it so much. So, Laura, thank you again for coming onto the show. Please take a moment to plug yourself, plug your book, tell listeners where they can go to find out more about you.
So my name's Laura Spinney. I have a website in that name, www.lauraspinney.com, My book is Proto, How One Ancient Language Went Global. It came out last year. It's just coming out now in paperback, and you can get it in all good bookshops.
Fantastic. And I say this about all of the guests that come onto the show, but really, do go out and buy the book. I enjoyed it so much. I think it's a really, really, really important work, and I'm so glad that it exists. So, again, thanks, Laura. Talk soon.
Thanks, Ray. It's been a pleasure.